Hi there. In this episode, we talk to Joseph Lyth about the passive house that he built to a super tight budget. Joe is an associate architect at Respond Architects and a certified passive house designer. He's originally from North Yorkshire and moved to New Zealand in 2016. Clima inspires and educates people to create healthy, durable and energy-efficient buildings to live, learn, work and play in. Well, welcome, Joe. Welcome to the Clima podcast. How are you going today?
Good, Simon. Thanks, mate. Yeah.
Awesome. Now, Joe, just thinking back about when you grew up in the UK, what was the house like that you grew up there?
So I grew up in an 1890s solid sandstone farmhouse in the Yorkshire Dales. It was 3 fields from the road and about half an hour from the local village. So a little bit out there, but it was very beautiful. But it was, cold in winter. Pretty good in summer because it had quite thick walls. We had an open range in the kitchen and a fireplace in the living room. And I remember watching the TV in the evenings with the door closed on the living room and feeling pretty sleepy. And then when it was bedtime, literally sprinting upstairs to get under the covers because it was so cold. It was wonderful growing up. But the house was not the healthiest, shall we say, especially with the open fires. And I remember ice on the inside of the windows in winter sometimes and things like this before we changed them to double glazing. It used to be single glazed and rattly and stuff. So pretty old.
Wow. And when you were growing up, what encouraged you or sort of excited about getting into architecture?
I actually wanted to do sculpture when I finished school.
Okay.
I applied for a sculpture course in South Wales because I loved making things. I loved being hands-on and I loved kind of exploring how to do things, I suppose. But I'd always loved building as well. Like Lego was my favourite toy of all time, still is, let's be perfectly honest. So then I instead went to Australia as a teen to calm down, as they say, and then came back to the UK and was a bit of a loss for a while. But my aunt in London's an architect and she just said, would you like to come down and give us a hand and see what you think, basically. So I started working for them in West London. It was all very loft extensions on Georgian terraces and fitting a lot into a small space, but making beautiful things and beautiful spaces within tight constraints, which I really enjoyed. And I just realised it was kind of everything I wanted it to be, because there was the artistic side of designing and drawing and creating, and also the technical side of understanding how things had to fit together, I suppose, really. I then started working for another architect as well, and they both eventually, after a year or two, said, you're all right at this. You might as well go to uni and look at it. So I thought, I'll have a look at that then. And start at Kingston Uni. So I did my bachelor's there and worked for both firms throughout the whole thing. So it was kind of the real world thing alongside the creative side as well, which is really cool. It just felt like what I was needed to do or wanted to do, I suppose. Yeah, and then I started working for a larger firm in central London, John McCaslin and Partners. So we had offices in Edinburgh and America and Doha and all sorts of bits and pieces. So I could work on botanical gardens in China and, massive film studios in Russia and all sorts of things. So it was pretty cool, to be honest. Yeah.
Nice. And then what prompted the move over to New Zealand for you?
So we lived in London. I had finished uni and was working for a small practice in South London, which was very design-based because I always felt like I'd kind of had a lot of technical knowledge, but hadn't had the opportunity to spread my wings as much. But we, at the same time, moved to North London. So I was commuting 2 hours each way, morning and night, if South West trains ran on time, which they did not. And the practice wasn't what I'd hoped it would be. And the expectation of selling your soul to the industry kind of impacted me because Sarah and I just got engaged and it was this new life we were starting together, and there was so much more than just the job. After about 6 months of this, of commuting 2+ hours every morning and 2+ hours every night and in unrealistic expectations of working hours and things, we decided that we'd had enough. Basically, we couldn't afford to move closer because rentals were horrific. It's not just Auckland; it's other places as well.
Yeah.
I applied for jobs in outside of London, so Cambridge, Oxford, and all sorts of things, and I got offered 4 jobs actually. But I've got relations in Western Australia that couldn't make our wedding, and so their present was tickets to Australia to come and see them instead. And we thought, well, we're going all that way. why don't we go traveling for a bit instead, So the options were traveling for a while or starting a new job. And we thought that the traveling's probably not going to come round again, so let's give that a go. So I put the jobs off and we came to Australia for a month, and then some of Sarah's family lived in New Zealand for a while. So we thought we'd give this one a go and got a working holiday visa. We were going to fruit pick, but I bought my CV and portfolio because CAD work earns more than fruit picking, we'd hoped.
I'm sure.
I got the job 4 days after getting off the plane, which is a bit sooner than we'd hoped. We wanted to travel for a bit, so we put it off for a couple of weeks. And on the 30th of March, 2016, I started work, so only quite recently. And I just loved it and loved the country.
So talking about when you set yourself up here in New Zealand, I know the first time I met you was I came along and met you at the house that you were living in at the time with your family. Now,
That's
tell me a little
right.
bit about your experience with your
Yes,
New Zealand rental property.
So when we first came here, we Airbnb'd a room for a few weeks, and then we bought a van. Gary, we called it. It was fantastic. And we did a few weeks kind of camper vanning around the North Island. And then we started work, and we didn't really know what we wanted to do, so we just kept renting this room in this house in Grey Lynn, an amazing old villa property overlooking Western Springs Park. So we saw AC/DC and Metallica and stuff over the back wall, which is flipping awesome.
Yeah.
But it was a solid brick house, single glazing, and glass louvered windows in the kitchen. And in the winter at night, there was a ventilation grill in our bedroom ceiling, and we literally saw glowworms through it. It got so damp and cold up there, basically. So it was a really cool place to live, but definitely not the most comfortable. But because of where I'd grown up in the Yorkshire Dales, I was relatively used to it, to be honest. After a while, we kind of thought, well, we're going to be here for a while. We should probably look at another house for just us rather than sharing a room in a shared house. So we rented this little granny flat down in Murray's Bay, and it was perfect for us at the time. It was, 2-bedroom, pretty small, a nice protected garden, so it wouldn't get too windy, or that's what we thought was a good thing at the time. But it was cold in winter. It was really hot in summer. There wasn't much air movement because it was so well protected, so you didn't really, even if you opened the windows, you wouldn't get much ventilation at all. We'd have heaters on in one room in the winter, and the room next door would be 10 degrees, so we're spending all this money trying to heat the house and it not working. And then in summer, you'd have fans running to try and draw fresh air in, but the air outside was as hot as inside, so it wasn't doing anything, basically, from a comfort perspective. So we just kind of put up with it. But then we thought, we've been married for a while, we should probably, maybe start a family or something. So we had our first child, and she was just getting sick all the time before even going to daycare. And her cot was next to the window in the room they were in, and we'd literally have to squeegee it. It was like a shower, you'd squeegee it, the amount of water running off, it was horrific. It was horrible listening to her coughing every night. And then we had our second child, and the same thing started happening again. And we just didn't know what to do. Basically, we were trying to heat it, we were trying to ventilate it, we were trying to cool it. We had a dehumidifier running pretty much full stop, and we had to empty the bottom of it like 3 times a day. The amount of moisture it was taking out of the air inside the house, it was just, not a good place to be, basically.
Wow. So after your experience of this terrible house and feeling unhealthy for your kids and everything, what did you plan to do? So obviously you're an architect and you wanted to get into the housing market in New Zealand. What were your thoughts and what went into planning and designing this house for your family?
We basically, after lots of late nights and glasses of wine and all sorts of things, decided, we need to do something about this. We'd already had 2 kids and, they were growing up. We knew we had to move to a bigger property at some point. And so we looked at a few rentals around the area, and you could walk in and smell the damp. They were all the same things, single glazed, if you're lucky, double, probably badly insulated, obviously not very well ventilated. And you could almost smell the paint that they'd painted over the mold with when you walked in to view them. And we just couldn't do it. We knew exactly the same thing would happen. They would keep getting sick. So we thought, what's the next steps? What's the other things we could look at doing? And around the same time, I lost one of my grandmas back in the UK. So we got a little bit of money from that. And we also had a bit saved. And we thought, well, sod it. Let's see if we can build a house. And at least then we know what we're starting with as a base level of performance for this building. So we looked at, relocatable homes. And around this same sort of time, I learned about kind of building performance in uni. We had a whole section of the thesis that was about, ensuring ventilation and continuous insulation and vapor barriers and thermal bridges and all sorts of things. It was part of learning architecture at uni, because the university I went to balance technical knowledge and creative knowledge quite well. You get some unis that are very sort of floating robot cities in the sky, and you get some that are very sort of, drafting and technical side. This one, I feel, balanced it really, really well. But around this time that we were looking at building a house, I was also learning more about building performance, about energy modeling and all sorts of bits and pieces. So we kind of thought, well, what are the priorities? What do we need to do to make sure we're going to have a healthy house? And it was continuous and good insulation. It was good windows that weren't solid aluminium so we wouldn't get condensation on them. It was making sure we had proper ventilation to remove any moisture, and if it could be balanced, then we could retain our heat as well, so our heating bills are lower. And it was about making sure that we knew whether the house would achieve these things or not. So we spoke to a couple of kind of relocatable homes providers, and we said, would you be interested in working with us on getting better windows and looking at energy modeling the designs and seeing where we can fit? And a lot of the feedback was, no, we have these are what we do, this is the way we do things, we're not really interested in looking at anything new at the moment, sort of thing. So we thought, right, well, if they're not going to do this, then we're going to have to do it ourselves, basically. How are we going to make this work? We did not have a big deposit. I think we had $75,000 or something like that altogether. So, we couldn't build a mansion, but we didn't really want a mansion because you've got to clean it. Children are messy. So we thought, okay, let's design something. And, in the meantime, we'll start looking at sections around the area and just kind of get an idea of what sort of cost we'll be looking at and whether this is feasible. I'm sure most architects and designers spend at least 1 or 2 evenings every now and then drawing up their dream house sort of thing. So this was our realistic dream house sort of thing. So we thought, what do we want? How big do we want our bedroom to be? Measured our existing rooms. Yeah, a little bit bigger so we could have another piece of furniture in it. So, 3.5 meters by 4 as opposed to 3 by 3 or something like that. So we really kind of focused on what we wanted to live in rather than, it needs to be 300 meters squared. What can we fit into that space? So we thought about each space individually. How many bedrooms? We need a study. We'd like a laundry where we can put all our utility stuff and keep it separate. A separate toilet, which is one of my wife's stipulations. We must have a separate toilet, especially when the kids get older and stuff. So we kind of started with the puzzle pieces, then fitted those together into the design, while also thinking about the aesthetic and the spaces. So I really like double height spaces because it makes things feel bigger. And when we're talking about a compact footprint, having height enables you to make it feel more spacious. Views through, I always talk about kind of going to castles when I was in my youth and being in the massive big dining hall and seeing this tiny little window up in the corner and suddenly realizing that there's another space and there's kind of further things. So adding those sorts of elements to the design to add moments of excitement and beauty and interest and intrigue. So it wasn't just a box, basically. So we kind of produced these designs, and at the time it had cedar shingles all over the outside and, really nice landscaping and driveways. And we were like, this is what we want. This is kind of the big picture. Let's go and get this priced and see if it's realistic, basically. We'd found a section around the same time. We wanted to be no more than an hour from work, which was challenging, but we managed to find somewhere, which scraped our budget. I think we had to go higher than we wanted to at the time. And this is 2018, 2019, we were looking. But found somewhere we loved the view, loved the feeling. And so I took this design, put it on the section and spoke to some builders that we work with and said, hey guys, this is our budget. We'd spoken to the bank, and with our deposit and our earning and stuff, I think we could borrow up to $400,000 or something like that on top of the section the price we were looking at. And the builder kind of said, oh, well, that is going to be tight, but we'll have a look at it for you. I'm sure we can make it work, sort of thing. And naively, we thought, great. So we signed on the dotted line for the land. And then the builder kind of came back and once had looked at everything, said, right, so we got pricing back from all our subconsultants and it's coming out at $750.
Wow.
So yeah, we kind of bricked it a little bit and thought, what the hell have we done, basically? But then we'd bought the land, we'd signed on the dotted line. We had to build something or sell it, at a loss of a deposit or whatever would have happened. But we still needed to do it because we wanted our family to be healthy and have somewhere healthy to live. And that was the defining factor, was we need somewhere that our family are going to be healthy to live. So we sat back and thought, right, well, we don't need the cedar shingles. We don't need the landscaping. We can drive the car up the gravel driveway that's washing down the hill, whatever. We just need something that's nice and healthy. So we went through this kind of like exercise of stripping out what wasn't prioritizing the performance and the health of the building, while trying to balance what could be done in the future to maintain the aesthetic and the way we wanted to live. And that was fun.
I'm sure.
We essentially went back to the drawing board and said, right, well, take these things out. What we're going to use to build it. We looked at using SIPs. I'd seen some SIPs projects recent at the time. And as a product, it just made sense to me. And it also meant you didn't need to line it. So you'd be saving on the plasterboard and the painting. You could just leave it exposed.
So, Joe, just for the audience, just to confirm, that's structurally insulated panels, am I right?
Yes, yeah, sorry, yeah. So we did design, when I was kind of looking at how to achieve performance during this time, I was exploring different options for building it, continuous insulation, adequate levels of insulation, so using energy modelling to see how thick we needed everything to be. And I found some projects that did structurally insulated panels, which were essentially prefabricated sandwiches with insulation in the middle and timber on the outside. I cut to shape in a factory, delivered on the back of a truck. They go together like a Lego set, which is probably why I like them so much. And the performance you get is higher than framing because there's less timber in them, basically, and they're significantly quicker. So while the product is usually more expensive, the overall project cost usually comes out, in our experience, about the same. So this was a system we decided to use for most of those reasons. And then we thought, okay, so what else do we need for the performance of the building? We need really good windows, because the windows are part of your thermal envelope. They're part of your air tightness. They're part of your weather tightness. They need to do a lot of jobs, so they need to be pretty good to do them well. So we didn't want to compromise on the windows. We wanted to make sure that we were getting fresh air all the time and that we were retaining as much of our heat as we could. So a balanced ventilation system was an essential. Ensuring there was no thermal bridging, so making sure that we weren't using materials that would bridge the insulation layer, so there's no steel at all in the house. I made sure and worked very closely with the engineers to make sure we could achieve the spans with the timber, etc., which also hopefully kept the cost, or mitigated cost, without having big steel beams and connections and things, while keeping the design more simple, because it's all the same thing. It's not adding in additional trades or whatever. And then it came down to finishes. So we always talked about the cladding, simplifying the cladding. We just went with plywood, board and batten in the end. Metal roofing. And then inside we said, right, we'll just paint the inside of the SIPs rather than plasterboard and stuff. The bathrooms, we just need them to work. We don't need a $3,000 trap. We went down to Trade Depot and found some cost-effective fittings. I won some linings on Facebook for the walls, which Facebook competitions are sometimes real. They're not just spam. For the flooring, we looked at, we got some commercial grade vinyl, which was the end of line. So we got that for free from a supplier. And all of these things can be replaced if we want them to. But we've been living there for over 3 years now, and they're still working absolutely fine. So we didn't need the high end. We didn't need the fully tiled bathrooms, because we just need a bathroom that works, that stops water getting into the building fabric and helps the kids get clean. And it does it. The kitchen as well, you can spend thousands upon thousands on a kitchen, but it just needs to work at the end of the day. So I decided to, I hadn't made anything in a while. So we bought some plywood through the construction contract. I quite like casting things, so I did a cast concrete sink and a countertop, and all, basically built it myself for using YouTube. YouTube is great.
It is.
The drawers are a little bit sticky, but it works great. It's robust. It's still there. I really enjoy how it looks, and I think the plywood cost us $3,500, and the materials for the sink and the counter maybe like $300 or $400, and that is a robust, functional kitchen. It doesn't need to be $20,000. And that can be upgraded or replaced if we want to at any point. Whereas replacing the windows or replacing the wall or adding in a new ventilation system, that's going to be significantly more. So we kind of just went through this process of what is a priority, how are we going to achieve this, what can we do later, what could do ourselves, basically. And through that, we managed to get the contract cost down to where we needed it to be. Well, so we got it down where we needed it to be. And then we put it through building consent. We got a builder signed up, Cade Build Group, who were fantastic. And then we went to the bank and we said, we've got a builder, here's the contract, here's the building consent. And the bank said, okay, we're going to need a valuation to prove to us that this is going to be worth it, basically. So we got a valuation on the house and the value came back and it basically said for a single story, 3-bed house, according to the local properties, this is not going to be worth what this construction contract is saying it's going to be cost to build. And we went, sorry, we just want to build a house and live in it. We don't care what it's worth. We want to live in this house, but because the bank needs the value and the payback and stuff, we had to try and make this house worth on paper what the bank needed it to be worth, which is still crazy in my mind. So originally I'd designed it as a single-story building, but because we were using SIPs for the roof, it meant there was no trusses up there in the roof space. There was all this extra room within the thermal envelope we could use. So I designed it so that at a later date, if the family got bigger or if we wanted to, or if we could afford it, we could extend up into the roof space, add a 4th bedroom, add another bathroom. But to get the value up to where we needed it to be, we ended up having to add those things in without increasing the construction cost.
Wow, that's a tough ask.
So we got Kane down to the pub and we had had quite a long conversation with them about this. And they were brilliant. They worked with us really closely on how we can achieve this. So again, we went through another exercise of, right, what can we do later? What is the priority? This is what it's going to cost more to do this. Okay, so let's change. We had because we're rural, we're on tank water. We needed 2 tanks for drinking water and 2 tanks for firefighting purposes. So that's 4 25,000 litre tanks. I had already specified concrete in ground, so they weren't taking up space on the ground. We changed those to on-ground plastic tanks, and that saved us quite a lot. We took some things out of the contract, such as varnishing the plywood on the inside. We just left it exposed on all the interior walls. And just kind of went through this kind of refining process to see how we can bring the cost down. And we ended up just about getting it balancing. I think we had to pay an extra, I think it was $7,000 or $8,000 on top of what the bank would lend us to get the project to work, basically. So yeah, it was a real balance of prioritizing, but also thinking through every decision to make sure what we decided would not impact what we wanted to do in the future, if and when we could afford it. So it was a real balancing act, which was fun and stressful.
Now, Joe, you mentioned something earlier about energy modelling. Now, if I was Joe Bloggs in the street, I would assume that if I'm getting a new house built for me under the New Zealand Building Code, that it would be designed so that it was warm in winter and cool in summer. Is that not the case?
It's not, which I agree is a very strange thing. You can get a house which is built to the building code minimum. That will not be comfortable and will not be healthy. And it's interesting because the Building Act sets out certain standards that must be achieved. So, for example, E2 states that we must prevent water from entering the building from the outside. Great. Pretty simple. B2, durability, a building must not fall over. Pretty straightforward. Even E3, which talks about interior environment, said no surface must get cold enough for condensation or mold to form. We must have mold-free surfaces. But these are the intents of the Act. Then you have the code and the acceptable solutions, which are supposed to achieve the outcomes of the Act, but in reality do not. Thermal bridging, for example, is not really considered in the building code. Sort of is in E3 when it says that, steel members must have a thermal break over them, but it doesn't or didn't talk about slab edges, for example. So you can get a code compliant building that ticks all the boxes through simplistic ways of trying to achieve those outcomes. So for thermal performance, for example, you've got the calculation method and the schedule method, which dictate minimum R values for building elements underneath the schedule method. And under the calculation method, you can then change those R values so you can make one worse, but then make one better. And the issue with that is it's not thinking about the building holistically. You can add loads of insulation in the ceiling, but you can have really bad windows. But the insulation in the ceiling isn't really going to help because your windows are still really bad. So it doesn't think about how the building is actually going to perform. It just thinks about, is it ticking these boxes? So energy modelling is the only real way of assessing how a building will perform when it is being designed, because it takes into account all of the building elements. It takes into account the actual site, the actual climate. So within the building code, they've got specific R values for thermal performance in 6 different climate zones. But within that climate zone, you might have a building on top of a hill that gets sun all day, beside a building that's in the bottom of a valley that only gets a couple of hours of sun in the midday or something like that. Those 2 buildings will perform completely differently, but the calculation and schedule method will not take account of that. So you will not get any defined performance outcomes. Whereas energy modelling means you can account for that. You can put a building in a real site, and then you can refine the design to ensure you're going to meet the required performance outcomes, whether that's home-style performance levels or passive house performance levels, or just, 5 times better than minimum code sort of thing. You can set out exactly what you need to be and balance the performance with the cost and the client's budget to achieve these things. So within our practice, we try and energy model every project, irrelevant of whether they're aiming for a certification, because it allows us to have the confidence we are specifying the correct materials and products to achieve the outcomes the client wants, and potentially save them money a lot of the time, because rather than being conservative and putting in more insulation because we're not sure, we know we can get away with just this and maybe some better glass to manage overheating, for example. So it's something we should be doing more of in New Zealand. It is a pathway to achieve compliance underneath VM1 in the building code. And according to the Building for Climate Change workflow pathway, it'll potentially be required in the next couple of years as we try and kind of reduce our carbon emissions through buildings, basically.
A lot of people might have heard about some of the recent changes to H1 that have just come into effect. What would you say has been done right there? And what would you say that could have perhaps been considered alongside those changes, Joe?
So the H1 changes, there's been a few steps, and there will continue to be more steps as we kind of go through to the Building for Climate Change final caps. They have done a good job of saying we need to increase the thermal performance of our buildings, basically. So you will basically need to have thermally broken windows in your buildings going forward. Slab heads insulation, making sure your concrete slab is actually kept warm. And also trying to increase the levels of the insulation within the walls and the roof and the floor. But there are lots of things within the building industry that have been done for quite a long time, and change is difficult to drive. So, for example, with the walls, we use 90mm walls. I found that bonkers when I came from the UK, where our walls are about a foot thick, basically, and we have relatively similar climates in a lot of the country. But people are used to these thin walls, and it means you can maximise your floor area. So MB obviously had to work within a 90mm wall, because if they started saying you have to use a 140mm wall, for example, people are in uproar because losing floor area or increasing costs, etc., etc., etc. So they're obviously trying to tread a fine line between increasing performance without creating something that would be unrealistic for the industry, whether some people believe it's unrealistic or realistic, I suppose. But then you've got your ceiling, for example, which is a lot of the time you can increase the insulation. It's not really going to be impacted. You might have a truss seal height to look at, for example, but it's probably an easier win to put more insulation in there than in the walls. So the walls essentially didn't change in the H1 upgrades, but the ceiling, I think it nearly doubled or something like that,
Yeah.
So I can kind of see where they've come from to try and push for this, but it doesn't consider the building holistically, and it doesn't consider the impacts of their decisions in specific climates. I mean, I know we increased the number of climate zones, but as I've kind of touched on earlier, within those climate zones, there are very specific circumstances. So while we're increasing the insulation in the ceiling, we're not increasing it in the walls. So you're potentially going to get more of overheating issues because heat essentially rises, and so you're keeping more of it in. And as we're making buildings warmer air can carry more moisture, but there are no requirements about providing more or ensuring adequate levels of ventilation. So we're going to end up with significant issues for interior condensation. I think it was here actually a few years ago. It was called Leaky Building 2.0, the inside
That's
job.
The one. We've been talking about for a while
Yeah,
now.
absolutely. That we live in these spaces. We breathe, we cook, we shower, we have cats, whatever. And so there's moisture and there's CO2 and there's chemicals given off from our sofas and all sorts of things. And at the moment we rely on open windows, and we rely on people to open them enough time. and we rely on the weather to provide a temperature differential or a wind to drive that air out of the building, that will not work the majority of the time unless you've got a house on top of a hill and the wind always plays ball and people always remember to open and you always have cross ventilation. And it's relying on all these things that just will not happen or very unlikely to happen altogether. Whereas we need to be ensuring providing these minimum levels, especially as we're insulating more, which is why we're beginning to see overheating issues and more interior moisture issues, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the H1 upgrades were needed, but they needed to go hand in hand with other elements around ventilation, around ensuring you're mitigating thermal bridging. You know, we're making buildings warmer and wetter on the inside, but not stopping the cold surfaces that E3 does say so we should be stopping. You know, if you've got a steel column or a steel beam, if you've got a balcony, a cantilevering balcony with a steel beam, there's no requirements to firmly break that at the moment, nor are there, well, there are more now, but there's not many products available to help you do that. So we're kind of making more issues for ourselves because we're not thinking about the whole picture. We're just looking at very specific parts of the picture, and that's my concern with the H1 upgrades.
So as a potential homeowner wanting to build a home, how would you suggest they go about actually choosing a builder, choosing a designer or an architect, and actually moving down this path, which as we've discussed, there seems to be so many possible issues that could happen in the house, and not ending up with a house like what you have, where you've really considered all these aspects, but you've got the experience to do that. So how would you suggest someone actually go about this path?
It's a challenging landscape, I would say, for people, especially outside of the industry, and it can be mind-bogglingly confusing because there is, you know, all these different ways of looking things. There's code compliance, surely that should work. And then there's Homestar, oh, what's that? And then there's Passive House, what's this? And then there's Super Home Movement, what's that? And, you know, there's all these different things and different opinions, you know. Oh, passive solar design is fine. You know, we rely on the sun, you don't need any of that flipping mechanical stuff. What if there's a power cut? You might suffocate, you know, all these kind of misconceptions, opinions, and different ways of looking things, and somebody that's not with the industry, it must just seem like a magic eye painting. You know, you don't know what they're looking at, basically. So I suppose all you can really do is try and educate yourself, do your research, look into actual defined, measurable building performance outcomes. You know, this thing you're looking at, this design methodology that a designer might be talking about, where's the evidence? Where's the proof? Is there recordable outcomes showing that this sort of thing does work, for example? And as a homeowner, you really need to think about what outcomes you want, basically. There's always a difficult balance between, you know, property, especially in New Zealand, is seen as an investment. And there's no capital gains tax, so people can make money from it quite easily. So there's always that resale value to consider. And then if you're talking about resale value, you're talking about what the market wants. And the market is this, you know, intangible thing that tells everybody what they want to have. They have to have a 2-car garage. They have to have a tiled bathroom. You know, they have to have expensive kitchens, etc., etc. So then you get stuck in these finishes, which, while they look fantastic, have zero impact on the health and performance of your building. And they will cost more. So you're spending 70 grand on a kitchen, but you're still having to wipe the moisture off your windows and you got mold on your windowsills. That, in my mind, is crazy. So think about your principles. What do you want to have? You want to have a warm, dry, low energy house that's going to be comfortable all year round, basically. And to enable you to do that, you need to find somebody that can have that outcome, that understands that you need to have site-specific insulation, that understands you need to have ventilation, that understands that if you took a standard plan of a website and tried to do these things to it, it will likely cost more because you need to add things. But if you consider that from the start of the design process, you can simplify the design, you can account for the ventilation system, you can balance these additional things within the entire project. So in reality, it doesn't necessarily have to cost more than a minimum code house because you've thought about how you're going to include it from the start, basically. So I just recommend talking to somebody about it. And the difficulty is the industry is very much in change at the moment. And some people are on board with that change and some people are not. So try and find people that are part of the change, I suppose, is probably the best way of saying it. You know, change, a lot of the time change is good because it's moving forwards. And if people are saying, oh, you don't need that, oh, I've done this for 30 years, you don't need that, perhaps they need to start looking at doing that because, I don't want to drive a horse and cart. I want to drive a car. I don't want to use asbestos snow. Things change for the better because we've discovered new things and we've learnt new things. I grew up in a house with 2 fireplaces in it. I loved them. I remember we had a power cut one Christmas and we had to cut the turkey up and cook it on the open fireplace because we didn't have any power, basically. And it was an incredible memory.
Yeah.
But now I've learned that open fireplaces are incredibly unhealthy. They are affecting our lungs. We are breathing in the smoke and the particulate matter. And one of my parents has got emphysema because she spent her whole life breathing that in. So I love fireplaces, but I would never specify one in my house because I would like to be healthy. An outdoor one, flipping absolutely.
Yeah.
But so, we're always learning and there's nothing wrong with that. So yeah, change can be good.
Awesome, Joe. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been really good to have you on the show and look forward to catching up again soon.
Cool. Thanks very much, Simon.
Sharing knowledge is at the heart of our strategy to make buildings better for everyone. Sign up for our podcasts to learn more about creating healthy living conditions by protecting building structures from external and internal moisture damage. Thanks for listening. Looking forward to having you with us next time.